Good morning. Today I'm going to talk about chapters 21 to 26 for the final exam review. I will start with the ordeal of Reconstruction 1865 to 1867. Reconstruction involved extended controversies over the direction and control of the Reconstruction process, whether it would be Congress or the President, the readmission of Southern states into the Union, civil and political rights for former slaves, and the treatment of former Confederate leaders. At the end of the Civil War, many white Southerners still believed that their view of secession was correct and that their cause was just. For blacks, emancipation also meant the ability to search for lost family, the right to get married, the opportunity to form their own churches, and the opportunity for an education. The main purpose of the Black Codes was to ensure a stable and subservient labor force under white control. Congress objected to the readmission of the Southern states to the Union in December 1865 under Johnson's plan because the states had adopted black codes that limited the civil rights of freed slaves. The states had been readmitted without consultation with Congress. Many former Confederates were elected to high political office in those states, and it feared that the restored South would be stronger than ever in national politics because the Three-Fifths Amendments, or the Three-Fifths Compromise, was gone, and now they would have 12 more members in the House of Representatives. The basis of the battle or root cause between Congress and President Johnson was his 10% governments that had passed severe black codes. In the 1866 congressional elections, voters endorsed the congressional approach to Reconstruction. Both moderate and radical Republicans agreed that free slaves must be granted the right to vote. Most radical Reconstruction regimes in the South expanded the legal rights of women, created the first state-funded systems of public education in the South, launched public works programs, and were troubled by graft and corruption. But remember, all governments were troubled by that at all levels of government. That's why Mark Twain called this period the Gilded Age. Even though the Force Acts and the Union Army helped suppress the Ku Klux Klan, the secret organization largely achieved its central goal of intimidating blacks and undermining them politically. They will basically be successful in restoring white supremacy and the Democratic Party back to political power. Reconstruction might have been more successful if Thaddeus Stevenson's radical program of drastic economic reforms, the redistribution of land so that all blacks would have property ownership, and the stronger protection of political rights had been enacted. Chapter 22, the Industrial Era Dawns, 1865 to 1900. The national government helped to finance transcontinental railroad construction in the late 19th century by providing railroad corporations with land grants and loans. The greatest economic consequence of the transcontinental railroad network was that it united the nation into a single integrated national market. The United States will now have the largest domestic market in the world. The vast integrated continental U.S. market greatly enhanced the American inclination towards mass manufacturing of standardized industrial products. The U.S. system of mass manufacture of standardized interchangeable parts provided strong incentives for U.S. capitalists to replace skilled labor with machinery. The factors promoting the growth of manufacturing in post-Civil War America included plentiful, cheap labor, available investment capital, abundant natural resources, which included coal and iron, and massive immigration. The two late 19th century technological innovations that especially drew women, mainly white, native-born women, out of the home and into the workforce were the typewriter and the telephone. Andrew Carnegie's system of vertical integration combined all facets of an industry from raw materials to final product within a single company. The oil industry only became a huge business with the invention of the internal combustion engine at the turn of the 20th century. During the age of industrialization, the South remained overwhelmingly rural and agricultural. The attempt to create an industrialized New South in the late 19th century generally failed because the South was discriminated against and kept in constant debt as a supplier of raw materials to Northern industry. Despite generally rising wages in the late 19th century, industrial workers were extremely vulnerable to economic swings and depressions, employers' whims, sudden unemployment, and illness and accident. The Knights of Labor was weakened by its association in the public mind with the Haymarket riot, which it had nothing to do with, and its inclusion of both skilled and unskilled workers. Chapter 23, Political Paralysis in the Gilded Age, 1869 to 1896. Despite his status as a military hero, General Ulysses S. Grant proved to be a weak political leader because he had no political experience and was a poor judge of character. In the aftermath of the Civil War, waste, extravagance, speculation, and graft reduced the moral stature of the Republic, and that's why Mark Twain will give this period its name, the Gilded Age. A major cause of the panic that broke in 1873 was the expansion of more factories, railroads, and mines than existing markets could or would bear. As a solution to the panic or depression of 1873, debtors strongly advocated inflation through the issuance of more greenback paper currency and silver currency. The presidential elections of the 1870s and 1880s aroused enormous turnouts among voters, even though there were very few significant issues. One reason for the extremely high voter turnouts and partisan fervor of the Gilded Age was sharp ethnic and cultural differences in the membership of the Democratic and Republican parties. During the Gilded Age, the lifeblood of both the Democratic and Republican parties was political patronage. The Compromise of 1877 that settled the disputed Hayes-Tilden election led to the withdrawal of troops from the South and the virtual end of federal efforts to protect black rights there. This also meant that Reconstruction was over. The changes that affected African Americans in the South after federal troops were withdrawn in the Compromise of 1877 were the imposition of literacy requirements and poll taxes to prevent blacks from voting, the development of the tenant farming and sharecropping systems in agriculture, the introduction of legal systems of racial segregation based on Jim Crow laws, and the rise of mob lynching as a means of suppressing blacks who challenged the racist system. In the 1896 case of Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal facilities were constitutional. They will uphold separate but equal public facilities, which in effect legalize the system of unequal segregation between the races. Labor unrest during the Rutherford B. Hayes administration stemmed from the long years of depression and deflation that undermined workers' living standards. Reasons why the Chinese came to the United States were first to work in the gold fields of California during the California Gold Rush, and then on the construction of the transcontinental railroads, especially the Central Pacific Railroad that had to basically tunnel through the Sierra Nevadas and the Rocky Mountains. Chapter 24, America Moves to the City, 1865 to 1900. By 1900, American cities were becoming heavily populated, segregated by race and ethnic group, and geographically compact. The development of electric trolleys in the late 19th century transformed the American city by creating distinct districts, devoted to residential neighborhoods, commerce, and industry. Factors that increasingly made cities more attractive than farms for young adults include electricity, indoor plumbing and telephones, the advent of skyscrapers and suspension bridges, urban nightlife, and industrial jobs. The new immigrants who came to America after 1880 came from Southern and Eastern Europe, tended to settle in northeastern cities, usually did not speak proper English, unlike their children who learned and spoke fluent English, and they were largely Roman Catholic, Jewish, or Eastern Orthodox in faith. Besides serving immigrants and the poor in urban neighborhoods, especially in the slum areas, settlement workers like Jane Addams and Florence Kelley actively lobbied for social reforms like anti-sweatshop laws and child labor laws. The new immigrant groups were regarded with special hostility by many nativist Americans because their religions were distinctly different, and some new immigrants were politically radical. The Darwinian theory of organic evolution through natural selection affected American religion by creating a split between religious conservatives who denied evolution because they read the Bible literally and accommodationists who supported it. Americans offered growing support for the free public education system because they accepted the idea that a free government cannot function without educated citizens. Booker T. Washington believed that the key to political and civil rights for African Americans was economic independence and education that was either vocational or practical. Unlike Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois advocated advanced or academic education and complete political and social equality for blacks. The new, research-oriented modern American university tended to de-emphasize religious and moral instruction in favor of practical subjects and professional specialization. This is when the first graduate schools will be established. The first one will be at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. In the late 19th century, American colleges and universities also benefited from federal and state land grant assistance and the private philanthropy of wealthy donors. Authors like Mark Twain, Stephen Crane, and Jack London turned American literature toward a greater concern with social realism and contemporary problems. During industrialization, Americans increasingly shared a common and standardized popular culture. Chapter 25, The Conquest of the West, 1865 to 1896. Native Americans numbered about 360,000 in 1860, many of them scattered across the vast grasslands of the Trans-Mississippi West. In post-Civil War America, Indians surrendered their lands only when they received solemn promises from the government that they would be left alone and provided with supplies. The Indians battled whites to avenge savage massacres of Indians by whites. The Santa Creek Massacre in 1864 in southeastern Colorado will begin the Indian Wars to punish whites for breaking treaties, to defend their lands against white invaders, and preserve their nomadic way of life against forced settlement on reservations. The Plains Indians were finally forced to surrender by the coming of the railroads and the virtual extermination of the buffalo. Other factors that finally led to the defeat of the Plains Indians was the federal government's unwillingness to deploy unrelenting military force, the Indians' vulnerability to white people's diseases, and liquor. The 19th century humanitarians who advocated kind treatment of the Indians had no more respect for traditional Indian culture than those who sought to exterminate them. Let me say that one more time. The 19th century humanitarians who advocated kind treatment of the Indians had no more respect for traditional Indian culture than those who sought to exterminate them. Most religious reformers, federal boarding schools, and the Dawes Acts were all focused on the goal of undermining Indians' traditional culture and assimilating them into white American culture and society. So the Dawes Severalty Act was designed to promote Indian assimilation. They would assimilate Indians into American society by dissolving many tribes as legal entities, trying to make rugged individualists of the Indians, wiping out tribal ownership of land, and promising Indians U.S. citizenship in 25 years. Bitter conflict between whites and Indians intensified as the mining frontier expanded. The reason is that the mining frontier played a vital role in attracting the first substantial white population to the Trans-Mississippi West. From the 1860s to the 1880s, open range ranching was feasible on the Great Plains because of the availability of land. Longhorn cattle became profitable for ranchers when the railroads made it possible to ship them to market. So basically, they will drive them thousands of miles to railroad terminals in Nebraska, Kansas, and then Wyoming. The decline of the long drive and the cattle boom and the open range resulted from a series of extraordinarily severe summers and winters, overgrazing and overproduction, settlement of homesteading farms on rangeland, and barbed wire fencing. Opening of the Great Plains to farming was the result of improvements to farm technology, the building of railroads across the region, and advertising and promotional campaigns. One major problem with the Homestead Act was that 160 acres were inadequate for productive farming on the rain-scarce Great Plains. After exploring much of the West, including the Grand Canyon, geologist John Wesley Powell warned in 1874 that land west of the 100th meridian, or longitude, could not be farmed without extensive irrigation, and the problem of sustaining agriculture in the arid West was solved most successfully through the use of irrigation from dammed western rivers. In 1890, when the superintendent of the census announced that a stable frontier line was no longer visible, Americans were disturbed because the idea of an endlessly open West had been an element of U.S. history from its earliest beginnings. The Trans-Mississippi West was a unique part of the American frontier experience because of the scale and severity of the environmental challenges in an arid environment, the large-scale role of federal government in economic and social development, the large-scale engagement and struggle between white Anglo and Hispanic cultures, and the final military defeat of American Indians and their continuing presence in the region. Chapter 26, Rumbles of Discontent, 1865 to 1900. The root cause of the American farmer's problem after 1880 was low prices and deflated currency that were exacerbated by the overproduction of agricultural goods. Farmers were slow to organize and promote their interests because they were, by nature, independent and individualists. The original purpose of the Grange, or the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry, was to stimulate self-improvement through educational and social activities. The early populist campaign to create a coalition of white and black farmers ended a racial blacklist that eliminated black voting in the South. The political developments of the 1890s were largely shaped by the most severe and extended economic depression up to that time. Labor unionists, populists, and debtors saw in the brutal Pullman episode proof of an alliance between big business, the federal government, and the courts against working people. The severe economic depression of the 1890s also strengthened the populist argument that wage earners and farmers alike were victims of an oppressive economic system. William Jennings Bryan will gain the presidential nomination of both the Democratic and Populist parties, primarily because he eloquently advocated unlimited coinage of silver in order to inflate currency. So, in the election of 1896 between William McKinley and William Jennings Bryan, the major issue was free and unlimited coinage of silver at 16-to-1 ratio. McKinley defeated Bryan primarily because he's able to win the support of Eastern wage earners and city dwellers. The strongest ally of Mark Hanna and the Republicans in the 1896 presidential election was fear of the alleged radicalism of William Jennings Bryan and his support of free silver. The reality is the 1896 presidential election marked the last time that a serious effort to win the White House would be made with mostly agrarian or rural votes, because now more and more Americans are living in urban areas, not in rural areas. And the 1896 victory of William McKinley ushered in a long period of Republican dominance that was accompanied by diminishing voter participation in elections.